Hey guys, this video's for Anatomy and Physiology 1, and I will take you through the axial skeleton in this video. And so for the axial skeleton, I'll take you through all the features, all the landmarks and bone features of the skull, including all of the holes of the skull, sutures, even the fontanelles of the fetal skull. These are all real bones, by the way. As well as the vertebral column and how to differentiate between between lumbar and thoracic and cervical vertebrae, as well as the sacrum, coccyx, and then your ribs, the rib cage. All right, so let's start with the skull. So if you take a saw and you cut off all this top here, you call this the calvarium. This is called the calvarium here. And you put it back on, you can see the whole thing all together in one piece. We can start with the sutures. So in the adult skull, you'll only find a few then. This here is the your coronal suture, then separating the two parietal bones here. This is the sagittal suture. And then on the back here we have the lambdoid suture. This is posterior now, lambdoid suture. And then finally we have the squamous suture here. So again, this is the coronal suture, and then your sagittal suture going posteriorly here. This is the lambdoid. And then finally, of course, there's two squamous sutures, one on the left and one on the right. And the cranial bones are the frontal bone, two parietal bones, your occipital bone, your temporal bone, and don't forget that your squamous, technically the ethmoid bone, and the sphenoid bone belong to the cranial bone, cranial bones as well. This is the sphenoid bone here. Okay. These here are your orbits, nasal cavity, and and if I put this back on here, take a look at the occipital bone. All right, so the occipital bone is right here, and the skull articulates with C1 or your atlas, but it articulates with on these two little condyles here. These are your occipital condyles. So here, these are your occipital condyles, articulating with C1, with the first vertebra of the vertebral column. All right, and then you have your temporal bone. Here's the temporal bone. It's kind of hard to see. Here it is. You can see the outline here. All the way, and then you see this little crack right here. So this is the temporal bone all the way up like this. This is the temporal bone. And because this is the zygomatic bone, and this is the temporal bone, this end touching the zygomatic bone is called the zygomatic process. So the whole word would be, the whole feature, the whole thing would be called zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Just like over here, this is the zygomatic bone. So just this end that you see here, this would be called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. And over here, just this spot here is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And also on the temporal bone, you have a couple more features here. You have this, you can actually feel this behind your ear. This is the mastoid process. And then finally you have the styloid process. It's right here. Styloid process, like a stylus, styloid process, and the mastoid process right here. All right, let's open up the Calvarian here and we'll take a look inside. So now this person is facing up here, facing up. You have the sphenoid. If I take a probe, can kind of outline here, across here, and all this is the sphenoid. I'll do it one more time. Go up like this, and then around. This is all the sphenoid bone. Well, these two large areas here, these are the greater wings of the sphenoid bone. And just these two little areas here, this is the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. Okay? And then you have your hypophyseal fossa within the sella turcica. So this whole thing is the sella turcica. Sorry, the sella turcica. And just this little dip where the pituitary gland sits is your hypophyseal fossa. And there's, of course, there's a whole bunch of foramina in here, and we'll take you through those one by one. The ethmoid is kind of hard to see. It's like a cube, but you can't really see it as a cube. So we can just see some parts of it. Here's the top. Here's the superior part of it. So there's like this little shark fin. You see that little perpendicular, this little shark fin here? That's your crista galli. So that's the crista galli. And then there's a whole bunch of little holes. Those are your olfactory foramina. And the holes are in this horizontal plate here called the cribriform plate. So this is the cribriform plate in which you have a whole bunch of little holes called your olfactory foramina. And then this little shark fin here is called your crista galli. Okay, crista galli. And if we go like this, we turn it around, we can see a little bit more of the ethmoid bone. Now, at first you see you have your conchae here, you have these bottom conchae and you have these top conchae here. But actually this is not, these are not your superior. These are your inferior nasal conchae. If one is called a concha. However, these are your middle nasal conchae. So the middle nasal conchae belong to the ethmoid bone, and the superior nasal conchae, which you can't see from this angle, also belong to the ethmoid bone. Finally, these two down here are just the name of the bone. These are your inferior nasal conchae, and that's just the name of the bone. But these guys, you would say, like the whole name would be middle nasal concha of the ethmoid bone. All right, and then the last thing is there's this wall that exists here. It's actually sort of missing on this one here, but imagine this wall that goes up like this, then it meets halfway, then it goes down. Well, the top half is called the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. The bottom one is just the name of the bone. This is the vomer. You see here that I'm pointing to? That's the vomer, and that's just the name of the bone, just vomer. But the perpendicular plate, which is from halfway down here to the top, which is not showing on this particular skull, is called the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. So those are all the features of the ethmoid bone. Now, this is kind of broken off a little bit here, but you have two little nasal bones right here, two little nasal bones. And this is the maxilla. The upper jaw is the maxilla, and the maxilla actually kind of goes up to right here. So technically, the first bone, if you got kind of like going on the left, going from center to left, this is one nasal bone, and then the maxilla, and then finally right here you'd see the lacrimal bone, right here. 1, 2, 3. Nasal cavity right here. And and because this is the maxilla here, if we turn this around like this, there's this, you kind of see a little crack right here. Well, this is the palatine bone, and this is the maxilla. So this belongs to the upper jaw, and this is the palatine bone. It kind of goes around like a U. Well, this specific spot is actually called the horizontal plate. So this is the horizontal plate of the palatine bone, and this spot here is called the palatine process, because it's attached to the palatine bone here. This is called the palatine process of the maxilla. All right, and then you got the mandible. You got the body of the mandible, lower jaw. You got the body. You got the angle. You got the ramus. And the mandibular condyle is right here. Mandibular condyle. Condyle, just a name for the bone, that part of the bone that articulates. And that's your mandible. Again, you got your orbits here, nasal cavity here, and now let's do the holes of the skull. All right. Well, we kind of already touched. I'll take you through 10. I'll take you through 10 holes here. So the first one here, this is your olfactory foramina. Olfactory foramina. Where are they? They're technically in the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. And then the next ones, if you take your pen or your probe and you kind of right here in the lesser wing of the sphenoid, you see this, you kind of have to turn it. You see that little hole right there? Well, that's your optic foramen. These are your two optic foramina. Optic foramen. And the same thing, if you take your probe, you can't really see it, but unless you start to turn the skull all the way right there, right in there, that's your superior orbital fissure. And you can actually see it, you know, if you turn it like this, that this is your superior orbital fissure. You can see it right through the orbit there. Again, if you take your probe and you kind of do this, there it is right there. So that's your superior orbital fissure. And then the hole right next to it, just kind of go just lateral right there. That right there is your foramen rotundum. Foramen rotundum. Now, you see this? You see this? Here's your sella turcica here. Just lateral, this first hole right here, just lateral here and here. That is your foramen lacerum. Your foramen lacerum, and then two more here, just on the same level there. You have a big one and a little one. That's your ovale and spinosum. So this is your foramen ovale and foramen lacerum. Foramen spinosum right here. So the three in order are foramen lacerum, then your foramen ovale, and then your foramen spinosum. Then you have this ridge, like this mountain. You got like this ridge here, and you have like on this side of the ridge, you see that ridge? You kind of see it? On this side, you have a little hole and a big hole. Well, this little hole is your internal acoustic meatus, right there. And then this bigger one is your jugular foramen. Internal acoustic meatus, jugular foramen, and then the 10th one that I'll show you here, this is your foramen magnum. Foramen magnum. All right, so that's the 10 holes that of the skull that I'll take you through. And okay, so that completes the skull. Let me put this away. And on a fetal skull, we have a few fontanelles. You got the anterior fontanelle. Here's the anterior fontanelle. Closes around 2 years. And your posterior fontanelle. And these have a couple of names. Then you have 2 more here. I use anterolateral and posterolateral. So of course you have 1, 2, 3, 4 over here. So again, you have your anterior fontanelle, go all the way to the back, back, posterior fontanelle, and then anterolateral and posterolateral fontanelles. You can check for dehydration, that kind of thing. All right, so that's the fontanelles. Taking a look at our vertebrae now. We got a bunch of cervical, lumbar, thoracic. You just take the 3 major, and you can see there's clear differences. There's clear differences. I'll just take this one here. There's certain features that are true of all vertebrae. One is the body. They all have a body. They all have, I'll kind of move these over so you can see. They all have a spinous process, right here, spinous process. They all have transverse process. And lamina. The lamina holds the spinous process on, and the pedicles hold the body on. So this bone here, and this bone here, that holds the body onto the rest are called pedicles. So these are the pedicles. And the lamina, like laminated, kind of flat, is the bone that holds the spinous process on, transverse. And then here you have your superior articular processes. And if there's cartilage there, it would be superior articular facets. And then you have the inferior articular processes right here. So now, just looking at this thing, which way is this person facing? The answer is this way. So the superior articular processes are actually facing posterior, and the inferior articular processes are actually facing anteriorly. And when you put 2 together, like that, it's crazy, but you would say the superior articular processes of the inferior vertebra faces posteriorly and articulates with the inferior articular processes of the superior vertebra, which face anteriorly. Yeah. There's another hole that forms that you don't see at all unless you put 2 vertebrae together, and that's this side one here. That's this side one right here. You don't see it unless it doesn't exist unless you put 2 together. This is called your intervertebral foramen. Intervertebral foramen. See that? Right there, right where my thumb is. There it is. All right, and of course you also have your vertebral foramen here. and um, and those are the features of all vertebrae. All right, well, let's start with the cervical. Cervical are by far have the smallest body, smallest in size, because they carry the least amount of weight, just the weight of the skull. And so, how do you distinguish a cervical from the rest besides the size? You have two little holes on the sides in the transverse processes. So these are called transverse foramina. The little holes. You won't find those anywhere else. And also the spinous process is bifurcated. So this is called a bifid. See the little fork? It splits. You'll never see that anywhere else. Bifid spinous process. So that's how you can tell. However, there are two specialized excuse me. There are two specialized cervical vertebrae, C1 and C2. C1 and C2. C1 has another special name. This is atlas, alphabetical order from top to bottom, atlas, and then axis is this one. And the articulation between these two allow you to say no, rotation. But the articulation between C1 and the occipital condyles of the skull allow for flexion and extension, allow you to say yes. But these two articulations between C1 and C2 allow you to say no. Well, the axis has this specialized little bone right here, and you got this little ligament that'll kind of sit like this, holding this thing, keeping this thing from impinging on the spine, and that's called the dens, or the odontoid process. That's the dens, or the odontoid process. So you get whiplash in the car, break this off, this thing can impinge on the spine, which is serious. All right, so that's the C1, C2, atlas, axis, from top to bottom, alphabetical order. Then you have the rest of your cervical vertebrae. And then you have the thoracic. The spinous process point practically straight down. I mean, compared to this one here. Spinous process is really shooting down. It's almost like perpendicular with the ground. That's how you can tell. Also, one feature that these will have that no other vertebrae will have are your superior and inferior demifacets, or causal facets. Superior and inferior demifacets, which are on the body. Before we were talking about superior and inferior articular facets, but these are on the body of the cervical. So 12 thoracic, you only find those because those are where the ribs attach. Here, and the third one's actually way over here on the transverse. Okay, so the cervical, thoracic, superior and inferior articular superior and inferior demifacets, plus that, and it kind of looks like a giraffe, too. It looks like Melman, right? Giraffe. And finally, you got your lumbar. These are by far massive compared to the rest. The spinous process are short and boxy, kind of stubby spinous process, and you got 5 of them. Breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, and dinner at 5. All right, so that's your vertebrae. And then finally the ribs. I wouldn't expect you to know what number rib if it was just disarticulated like this, but you got your you got the head, you got the neck, so causal head, causal neck, tubercle, causal tubercle, and you got the body here, but you also have this, this little ridge. So this is called the causal groove. This is the costal groove. And it sort of makes this kind of sharp. So how can you tell left or right? Well, first of all, where you have all the head and that sort of thing, that's where you have articulation. So that means that this is always posterior. This is always posterior. So this thing could either sit like this or it could sit like this. But because you have your costal groove here, and that kind of makes a sharp edge like a knife, the sharp edge always goes down if you want to cut. Same thing with the rib. So that means that this must be the right rib because it articulates posteriorly, which means that this is anterior. And then the sharp edge has to go down like a knife, therefore this can only be the right rib. So that's how you can tell left or right. And then finally, if you have this little guy here, this whole thing is called the sternum. You got the manubrium, regions now, so manubrium, body, xiphoid process, manubrium, body, xiphoid process. And then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 true ribs, or you can call them vertebrosternal. Then you have 8, 9, and 10, which are false, or you can call them vertebrocostal. They do eventually attach to the sternum, but they're sharing the cartilage, so they're called vertebrocostal, or you could say vertebrochondral, or you could just say false. And then finally there are 2 more floating, they're just called floating ribs. Those are ribs 11 and 12. Or you could just call them vertebral. So you have vertebrosternal, vertebrochondral, and then just vertebral because they're floating and they only attach to the thoracic vertebrae. So that concludes the axial skeleton for Anatomy Physiology 1, and I hope that this helps, and enjoy and study well. Thank you guys.